Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to session 7 in the Spring 2023 SunoikisisDC Digital Classics program. This semester focuses on digital approaches to cultural heritage, and today we're focusing on 3D modeling and reconstruction. The instructors for this session are myself, Gabriel Bodard, University of London, and my colleague Orly Lewis from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And we're going to give the main content. Joining us for the discussion are Paulo Granados Garcia from the British Museum and Yotam Giladi from the Institute of Medical Legal Illustration, so I see, who will both have further comments and questions and discussion at the end. Those of you who are watching us live on YouTube, you can also find the supporting materials for this session at the link below the YouTube video. And please, if you're watching live, do use the live chat feature there to the right of the video to say hi, let us know you're there, and also make any comments, ask any questions as we go along, and at the discussion at the end. We'd love to have you involved in this discussion. That, I guess, is it by way of introduction. I just want to say a few words to sort of define the terms of this session. This is one of 3 sessions in this semester's program on 3D technologies, and the first session, which was scheduled for two weeks ago, but actually the video in that session was actually from a year ago, was on 3D imaging, which is the capture of an existing object or environment using photographic or other digital technologies to create a 3D model of that object or environment. This session is on 3D modeling and reconstruction, which is a slightly different technology involving an object that may or may not exist, or may not exist in its entirety or in the same state that it is in its ideal form, and which may be its past form if we're talking about an archaeological object, or maybe its future form if, for example, we're talking about architectural design where we're designing something that does not yet exist. But it's then about creating this object or part of this object from the ground up using some sort of software, so modeling, sculpting in some way. And this may be something. This may also be something that never existed and never will exist. You could be creating a fantasy or an artificial object or environment. And then the third session, which will be in 2 weeks' time, is then on other aspects of publishing and circulating 3D models, where we'll talk a bit about putting 3D models online in a useful, dynamic way, 3D printing, virtual reality, those sorts of technologies that we can do things with 3D models. So that's sort of the distinction we're making when we say 3D imaging and 3D modeling. It's all about creating models, but there are different ways of creating those models. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what we mean by 3D modeling and why we do 3D modeling, and some of the examples of that in this session. And we'll have one case study in particular that where Orly will talk about the Atomy project, which is a very, very exciting example of using 3D modeling to create images of not quite existing ancient views of anatomy, as I understand it. And then yes, we'll talk more about that. And then we will end this session with a hands-on exercise, which again is suggested in the supporting materials linked below this video, using the Sketchup software to create a 3D model of an ancient architectural feature that exists only in archaeological remains that are incomplete, and how we can use this software then to work up on that. And you will then have the opportunity to use the supporting materials we've created there to go away and try that out for yourselves as an exercise after this session. So that's the general sort of outline. And obviously any questions or comments anyone wants to contribute, wants to ask, we will also address. So that, I guess, is it from me by way of introduction. I'll hand over to Orly, who's going to give you a general introduction to modeling as an approach.
Okay, you can hear me okay? Can you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. So as Gabby was saying, what I'm going to be talking about here is just a brief introduction of 3D modeling and this reconstruction and this type of 3D modeling, and how it is research and how does it become scholarship and why so, before we both move on to the more detailed topics of the softwares and the case study that I'll present. So a big question here is, what makes a 3D model scholarship? Okay, why is it scholarship and not just some visual aid, for instance? So first of all, when we're thinking of this 3D model that we are creating, that we are reconstructing something in a 3D in a 3D visual, okay, which then is in fact the model. What we are doing is creating a visual interpretation of what we are reading in our sources. So the fact that it is an interpretation, and rather than putting it in words, we are putting it in a visual means, this 3D model, and the fact that it is an interpretation, and our interpretation of the text that we are reading, based perhaps just on text, just on one text, on several texts, on material sources. We can have a range of sources which help us understand a particular idea, a particular building, which, as we were saying, Gabriel was saying earlier, is not there necessarily anymore, or was never really there, but only described in words. Once we're putting that into a visual, we're interpreting the text and we're presenting our interpretation in this visual way. So this is one main issue of when we are thinking of the model as scholarship. Another point is not just this outcome of representing our interpretation, but also the fact that while we are doing this modeling process of interpreting the text and creating this visual representation of our interpretation, we are doing research. This modeling process is helping us to better understand our text or our other sources, and to think about the context of what might have been there, what they're trying to represent. And we'll see this also through the case study I'll present. This will become also a bit clearer, but this is, again, an important part to remember, is that it's not just the endpoint, this 3D model, and there we are, but it's really part of what we are doing. It's not just our output, but really part of the process and the research. So we have this 3D model based on sources that we are interpreting. We are representing this interpretation in the visual means, and insofar in this, and therefore we are creating this output, this interpretation that others will use, just as they would use a research article or a book. And we are also, as we are doing it, improving and working on our own interpretation and the research process. So this 3D model really has kind of, or the modeling process has this these twofold aspects in it. Now, in order for it to really be scholarship, however, and really an output which can help other scholars and they can use as another resource, another source for their own work and interpretation of the sources, and for their own research questions, this model, and this again would make it scholarship, has to have the accompanying information. You might have already encountered terms as metadata or paradata. It's not crucial if you haven't, but these are terms for these are technical terms for the information which comes with the 3D model to explain it, like we would want footnotes in an article, and other explanations which we are used to having in any scholarly output. So the 3D model would want to give some commentary of explaining the model, to give the transparency of how we reached our interpretation, and also how we produced this model. So not just why this is what we present in the model, these are the details, but also how did we do it, which decisions, which interpretive decisions we made on our way, based on which sources, more technical details of the software and modeling tools that we used, because these to affect the result, but also the references and really providing other scholars the means to follow up, and to criticize, to perhaps recreate and test if they can also reach the same conclusions and the same model if they would work through the same process. So really making it scientific, and therefore, as with any other scholarship, leaving this so-called we could say paper trail, in order to make it transparent and allowing others to understand the process it went through, its basis, and perhaps also to recreate it themselves or work based on that to follow up and go beyond in their research. Now, creating the 3D models and doing such work has quite a lot of challenges. As we'll see today, it's possible and it's very rewarding, but some things that we do need to take into account when we are planning, when we are thinking about how to do this, is first of all the practical issue of how do we model and who does the modeling? Do we do it ourselves? Do we engage someone who does it for us, who's professional in this field? And you'll get examples from both ends today. Another challenge is, or set of challenges, are the scholarly challenges, making sure that it's reliable and a useful model for other scholars, which touches upon and refers to the issues I was just talking about in the previous slides. And a third set of challenges is related to dissemination. How do we publish it as scholarship, and things that I'll touch upon today in my case study, but also you'll have a separate session on this. But really, how do we make it available for others? So this is really just to open this up and give this kind of context of why do we talk about 3D modeling in such a course, and where does it come into our science scholarship? Thank you. So back to you, Gabriel.
Great, thank you. I'm going to briefly talk about some practical issues. I put this slide up here, which has the downside of illustrating that I've stolen this slide from another event, but it has the upside of crediting the two other people, Valeria and Alicia, who provided a lot of the information that is in this set of slides that I'm showing just now, and who also, I should say, are responsible for almost every single thing I know about 3D imaging and modeling and dissemination. So all credit to both of them. It's maybe worth just unpacking a little bit, in addition to the very useful comments that Orly's just made, some of the different kinds of 3D modeling. I've said at the beginning, and Orly's given some more context to 3D modeling as the concept of creating something that doesn't necessarily already exist or exist anymore, but there's various different kinds of 3D modeling. So what we often think about with 3D modeling is something along the lines of computer-aided design, which is similarly the example I'm going to show later is very similar to that. You're basically building an artifact using digital architectural tools to help build that. But there's also other kinds of modeling similar to digital sculpting, so really creating much more sort of creative and free-form objects. There's also procedural modeling, which involves giving a bunch of parameters to the software and letting the software make the decisions about the shape that something will take. So, for example, you say, design me a building that is maybe 60% likely to have 2 floors, slightly less likely to have 3 floors, etc. That if it has so many floors, then it probably has fewer windows. It has different kinds of roofs, and see what it comes up with. And it's more useful to do that if you do it 1,000 times and see this sort of spread of things. There we see another kind of 3D modeling in various virtual worlds and simulations, games like The Sims and Minecraft, the Second Life environment, and the metaverse that's talked about a lot more than it's seen, I think. But all are examples of this, of where you can build virtual worlds of various kinds. And then there are real-time engines and game engines and so forth that do their own kind of 3D modeling and visualization as well. Specifically in cultural heritage and in archaeology, there are a few concrete, or this is just a few concrete examples of the sorts of reasons why we might use 3D modeling as a way of addressing the research questions. So, for example, these are all examples that Alicia gave me. So, visualizing light and shadow around an object at different times of day, how visible various things would be, lines of sight is another example of that sort of concept, where just looking at a plan or a drawing or even a photograph of a building only really shows us, potentially even a photograph only necessarily shows us what it looked like from that angle and at that time of day. What would it actually be like to walk inside that building? We see this massive monumental inscription above the front entrance, and from this photograph or drawing of the whole building, it's nice and easy to read. But would anyone walking in actually be able to read it? And at what times of day would they have been dazzled by the sun and therefore not able to read it? All these sorts of things that you can look at. You can also use 3D modeling if you use the right kind of software to simulate the structural strength of a building. And you can also use this to communicate these research findings, as Orly was saying, that it's not only what you discover by doing this, but how you communicate what you're discovering. So I'm just going to show a few examples, and this is by no means definitive, and even to the sense that it was sort of representative is probably a couple of years out of date, but just a few examples of software that people sometimes use in 3D modeling. Just to give you a sense of the range of the different kinds of things that are possible. So one very professional piece of software that is that's quite widely used and is very highly regarded among 3D modelers is Autodesk's 3ds Max, 3D Studio Max, which, as far as I know, last time I checked, only ran on Windows, which is a major disadvantage for large projects. It does have a free educational license for I think educators and students, but when that license expires, the full license is very, very expensive. I mean, not on a commercial scale, but it's very expensive for an academic purpose, at £2,000 or so per year. It's a very professional tool. It's compatible with the whole Autodesk suite of tools and gives you very granular control of the objects that you're modeling. So, for example, if you're modeling a building, you can do different things and attach different annotations, say, to each wall of the building, or possibly even to the different surfaces of the same wall, and so forth. It also allows the models to be exported in pretty much every format you could possibly want. So very expensive, but possibly one of the most powerful tools for this kind of modeling that you might find. Another tool that's extremely popular and very widely used is Blender. This is an open source tool, so it's free. It's also has lots of sort of plugins and all sorts of enhancements to it that happen over time. It's got a very, very active development community and user community. So if there's things you need help with, or things that aren't working, there's a lot of people who are potentially able to help with this. It works on all of the major platforms of personal computer. The downside to it that I would say is that it is quite it has quite a steep learning curve attached to it. It can be quite difficult to use, especially for a beginner. There are a lot of tutorials existing for it, but even still, there are it can be a little bit complicated to get started, and so it's not as widely used as you might imagine if you had just had a conversation with an enthusiast about it, who would tell you there's no need for any other 3D software in the world ever, because it's so good. It does have some slightly counterintuitive features. So it is extremely good software, but can be a little complex, especially if you're not intending to become a full-time professional modeler it can take a while to learn. Another tool that is quite powerful is Maxon Cinema 4D. This again works on all platforms. The educational license is relatively cheap at about £60 a year. The full license for commercial or private use is about 10 or 12 times that. It's very, very good for working with textures on objects. Again, it will export in pretty much all formats, and it integrates very well with the Adobe Creative Suite of tools like Photoshop and so forth. So it's very, very good for working with textures and applying photographic or artistic skins to your models or animations. Sketchup is a relatively much cheaper tool relatively speaking. There is a version of SketchUp from 2017 which is effectively free and was guaranteed to always be free, and in a sense that's true in that they've not started charging for it, but it's being 6 years old, it's no longer supported, and it's actually, you can't get it from the SketchUp website anymore, although there are still third-party vendors who will still offer downloads of that. When that version was completely free, it was very widely used in both teaching and research, and we've used it in our teaching, and I'll be using it in the demo at the end of this session. But as I say, that free version no longer exists. The Pro version is not hugely expensive, but at £250 a year for the private version, or £50 odd a year for the educational version. A little bit steep for teaching purposes. It obviously has a 30-day trial version, as most of these things do. So for learning, that's fine. There is also a web version which is free, has less functionality, but will do a lot of the basic things. So if you want to use the web version for today's exercise, that will work absolutely fine. It is very easy to learn. It's very intuitive, has slightly limited granularity, and has slightly fewer export options than some of the more professional software we've talked about, but is especially for sort of architectural sort of construction, is perfectly fine and works well, and is used in some professional contexts. It's not just a sort of playful tool, although you can get very playful with it because it is quite a lot of fun to play with, and it's, as I say, being very easy to learn. It's quite popular for that purpose. A slightly different kind of tool. So this is not really a 3D modeling tool, but it's a tool that can be used to turn 3D models into interactive environments. Is the Unity tool. There is a free, so it's free for personal use or for educational use, but for the Pro version, if you're going to use it to create outputs that you're going to sell, for example, or going to be part of a commercial delivery, there is about a €2,000 per year professional license. As I say, it's not something that you would really build in, although you can, but it's not designed for that. But you can import models from pretty much any format you can imagine, and you can use it to make any kind of interactive environment, game, virtual reality, etc. It's quite flexible for that. So that's a very popular tool for that. Another tool which I haven't used at all but looks very promising is the Rhino 3D tool, which again is quite expensive. Even the student version is 200 or so euros, and I forget if that's per year or if that's a one-off rate, but it's very much a free-form 3D sculpting tool. It focuses on building curved surfaces. You can see from the image there of this sort of design of this moped. So it has very, very precise design tools. Again, it's apparently very difficult to learn, or suddenly has a certain fairly steep learning curve. But if you're building something that isn't all made of right angles, it's apparently a very effective and promising tool for that. And my last example for this purpose, I've just added this to the list, so it wasn't on the table of contents at the beginning, is sort of at the other end of the scale, the very, very low end tool. This is completely free. It's an online app, and there are many others like this. that has fairly basic functionality. There's not much you can do with it, but it is very easy to use. It has a limitation in terms of the scale. You can only import up to, I think, 25 megabytes of individual objects, which if you've ever worked with 3D models, you know is really small. But if you want to knock something up to 3D print, for example, that doesn't need to be massively high quality or whatever, it's actually very, very usable, very easy to learn, and has all sorts of presets built in. So you can import one of the included objects and then sort of build up from there and do various things with it. I've been using it to take 3D models that I've downloaded, for example, like this little owl that I found on Sketchfab, and modified it by slicing the back off to make it sort of flat at the back, and then drill a little hole in the back of it, into which I've then embedded magnets, and you can then use these. I mean, you could use them as fridge magnets, for example. That's not quite what I've been designing them for, but it's very easy to do a quite quick sort of design with that. So just to say, this was just a few examples. There are many other tools out there that will do this. Some very, very expensive ones that are very specialist, and some of them have a steep learning curve. The institutional licenses in particular can be very, very expensive indeed. There are also all sorts of free apps which have limited functionality, but if you want to do something in particular, you may well find one that works with that. But my final point really is that having said that this is a bunch of tools and these are some of the reasons why you might choose them, in practice, your decision about what tool to use will often be based on a combination of what skills you already have and what you know. So if you already know Blender, then why would you learn another tool? Use Blender because you know it. And secondly, if you're working on a particular project or at a particular institution, they will probably have their preferred tool already, and you will probably end up working with that. So the decision may not be based entirely on this set of functionalities and prices and so forth. It may be based on more pragmatic decisions, such as what you already know or what the people you're working with already know. So that, I think, is that's all I had to say for this part. Let's get really concrete now. Back to Orly.
Okay, so hi again. So I'm gonna talk about the case study of reconstructing in 3D anatomical ideas, and specifically pre-modern anatomical ideas, so ideas that we have in textual descriptions. I'll explain this in a moment, and I'll give you a brief overview just so you have the context of what Greco-Roman anatomy, what does this mean for us when we want to come and model it, what's this field? And then I'm going to talk about how we do it at Project Academy, which I'm leading, which is a project on the history of anatomy funded by European Research Council. So I'm just going to explain what we're trying to do, our questions, and the team, which is important for the various practical reasons, also that we were talking about the modeling. And then I'll talk about our method and workflow towards the model from the ancient text. And I'll talk about the way we present our results and disseminate them through the tailor-made platform which we've developed. So I'm going to talk about this very particular case study, which is very large scale, but I'm going to touch upon the various issues that we've been discussing, and let's dig into things. So Greek and Roman anatomy is a lot of terminology, a lot of technical details about cavities and vessels and arteries and parts lying behind one another, on top of one another. We have a lot of information, and it's very technical information, as you can imagine, for an anatomical description of the internal parts of the body. So just to give you an example of what one might have to deal with. So this is a citation, a quote from Aristotle in the 4th century BC, so 2,500 years ago, telling us that the heart has 3 cavities. It is situated inward from the lungs. at the junction with the windpipe. It has a fatty membrane, by which membrane it is also attached to the great vessel and to what he calls the aorta. So already we have quite a lot of parts, lots of details about where they're placed, how they're connected, and so forth. And again, this is one example from very numerous examples that we have, because when we talk about a Greek and Roman anatome, so the term anatome in Greek, which refers both to what we call anatomy today, the field of knowledge of the structure of the body, but also to the actual practice of opening a body, a dissection, and examining it in order to learn the details, to learn anatomy. So when we talk about this ancient anatomy, we need to realize that what we actually have is many anatomies, okay, in the plural. I've shown here on the screen also a few examples of just some anatomists from antiquity, some known doctors who also wrote quite a bit about anatomical issues. Each of them, this was a field in the making. I mean, today, if you open an anatomical atlas or you go and learn anatomy, wherever you learn it, whatever book you open, you'll learn the same anatomy. There's a standard. We're talking in a period 2,500 years ago, where most of what we know today was observed at some stage, but still it was a field in the making. So each physician is opening the body, exploring it and understanding it a bit differently, describing it a bit differently, and using his own terminology to also explain it, causing a lot of overlap and diversity and ambiguity with the terminology that then reached us through the many texts that they have left us. So we have dozens of texts which deal with anatomy, which have detailed anatomical descriptions, where these authors are explaining what they saw inside the body or how they think the body is structured, usually based on what they were seeing. So, and again, we don't have any images of these. They didn't leave us any images. What we have is their words, as the quote I showed before. And most of what they were looking at were animals, just to put that on the table, rather than humans, though they did also look at human anatomy, internal anatomy as well, at certain periods or for certain issues. So this again, just to kind of give you an idea of what we are dealing with. So at Atlami, at our project, what we're trying to understand, our research questions, okay, so before, why are we even modeling? This is what we're trying to achieve, is to understand how the Greek and Romans investigated, understood, and described the structure of the body, how their ideas, their understanding of the anatomy, their research, and the terminology they had used, shaped one another, and also what were the conventions of anatomical textual descriptions, so from the literary perspective. What we basically do, the way we're going about answering these questions, is really the core of our work is taking these textual descriptions and turning them into 3D visualizations and into dissections, and especially into annotated visual documentation of these dissections with annotations explaining them to scholars. I'll focus today obviously on the issue of 3D visualizations, though I will touch upon the dissections also for 3D reasons. You'll understand what I mean in a moment. And what we're also doing is developing a tailor-made research interface, a digital anatomical atlas, in order to present our models and interpretations with the scholarly means that scholars need. So all of this is what I'm going to be showing you. But what is important is that the way we work, and this is again thanks when we consider the practicalities of how one goes about this, having a research grant where I can have a team in which every person brings their skills. So we have our textual researchers, the classicists, the historians of science who are working on the text, but we also have professional anatomists. We also have the 3D modelers, and one of them, our lead modeler, Yotam Giladi, is here with us today. who actually do the 3D modeling. So again, I'm giving you a very different example where I myself as a researcher, the textual researcher, I'm not doing the actual modeling, but as you'll see, I'm very much part of the process. We have the software developers and the data scientists and other aspects of the team, which will come into, I'm putting this here at the background for a moment, because all of these, you'll soon see how all of this fits together for our needs and for what we are doing. So I'm going to take you through our workflow. It seems like, we go from 1 to 2 to 3, from the textual analysis to the anatomical deciphering to the modeling. But as I'll mention while I'm talking, this is very much an iterative process where we always kind of go back to the text at each of these stages. As I said earlier on, the 3D modeling is improving our understanding of the text and of the anatomy. So we begin by translating the text. We work on Greek texts mainly. We have some Latin texts. We also have text in Arabic from the 9th century translations of Greek texts, which are now lost. So we have to work with the Arabic. But we take the original text and we translate it into English. So as we all know, translation is already part of interpretation, putting it in our own words in a different language. For us also, it's a crucial stage in allowing all the team to work together on a text, even if people don't know that particular language. Now, we're translating these texts as philologists and scholars have been doing for centuries by close philological analysis, close reading, and we're also using what is called distant reading or computational methods. I'll just talk about this very briefly here. We are doing a lot of tagging of our text for semantics, for various categories that we have. We are annotating the parts of speech, the dependencies. These are sometimes very technical terms. Some of you from other sessions in this course or other courses might know this more closely, but basically we're taking each word and giving it different layers of it, tagging it with different layers of information, grammar, syntax, the anatomical categories that we have defined. For instance, is it a body part or is it a description of a part, a quality? Things to do with textual structure, various sentiments in the text, or where the second person is used in our text. And this is giving us quite a lot of information, a lot of data that we can share with others, also for annotating ancient Greek or ancient languages, understanding various insights about our material. Excuse me. And it's also allowing us to automate various processes, to use machine learning to really automate our tagging, and also create automated extraction of our data and expedite the process. I'm mentioning all this because you'll soon see some of how some of this information is made apparent and is related very much to the modeling, the words, the references, and so forth. Once we have this translated and text, we can move to the anatomical deciphering, which we do together with our anatomical experts. Most of them are from the veterinary field, as I said, because this is what our authors are looking at, and this is what their descriptions are based on. We do this through discussions. We also do it through looking at books together, but we also do it by dissecting together and looking inside the animal as the ancient authors tell us to do it, or trying to really identify what they're describing, even if we didn't find it in the textbook, or our anatomists and our veterinary or human surgeons cannot understand what the ancient text is describing. So there's a lot going on at the lab when we are dissecting. What I want to show here is that what we are doing is also creating 3D. We're doing photogrammetry, so we are doing also the 3D imaging. You can see it here with a 3D scanner. We've discovered that actually the best apps and the best things to use are probably in your mobile devices, your tablets and phones. But we are doing this in order to also create 3D images or 3D models from our of the actual dissections, which have their own uses for scholars. And I'm not going to go into this, but just to again show you this other perspective and thinking of what in an unexpected way where 3D photogrammetry can come in to your research or to various fields. So once we have this, so just to say maybe about this dissection, so this is really part of our attempts to decipher the text, to understand the text better. So after these dissections, we do have a better understanding of the text. And with this better understanding of the text, we can move together with our modelers, with the 3D modelers, to create the visual interpretations and representations of our understanding of the ideas, the anatomical ideas in the text. Now, let me show you a bit more the sort of behind the scenes of this process. So actually, it starts with a very detailed table of instructions for our modelers. It has a list of the parts, the names in transliteration from the original language and in translation, and detailed instructions of what one needs to create, what one needs to model. It has information about the source on which our interpretation and these instructions are based. Is it the text or is it other material? How certain are we about this? It has various commentary questions and open questions to the researchers, which animals it's based on. And as you can see also, it has the Greek words, the reference. So we are very much still connected to each part we know what its basis is. We haven't lost the textual basis and we haven't lost our interpretive process, thinking again back to the transparency. And you'll soon see where these things come in. Then we move to the modeling process. So I'm going to show you a screen capture of part of actually from Yotam, from Yotam's screen while he was modeling. This is kind of a condensed video of various stages of the modeling using different software. This will be the modeling of the digestive system according to Aristotle, on which a model for which was responsible one of my students, MA students, Dimitris Rochi. And what you can see then here is really just the various stages of creating the digestive system. So this might look different for different parts that we've created, and for each kind of model on each kind of anatomical part, we might need to create a different, work a bit differently. Now, this process here as well is not linear insofar that while modeling, after creating a first draft of the model, then Yotam or the other modelers are coming back to us. So working with us with a kind of screen share to talk about, are we sure that this is exactly how it needs to look? Should this be the angle? Should this be the width? Should this be the location? And I'll return to these kind of questions presently. But again, showing just how much, I mean, the modelers are not just, I'm not just sending them the instructions and they do the work and then we have a model. It's very much always work in progress and always working together. Even if I myself am not doing the actual modeling, I'm very much designing it and planning it and together with the modelers. And you can see here the final result for this particular model, again, the digestive system according to Aristotle, so 2,500 years ago. So now I want to talk briefly about the importance of this part of the research, of how modeling really improves our research. So actually creating these models, creating these visual representations of our interpretation and understanding of the text requires much clearer decisions than if I were writing up my results in an article, or even if I was creating it in 2D. And it forces me all the time to return to the text and realize that I had glossed over things which just I thought I had solved it. I've just translated the text and everything is fine. So, and when I come to model, I need to make decisions which I didn't even realize had to be made. So just to give you some examples. So we have sentences such as the vessel splits near, para in Greek, the ear, or it extends from the spleen, or we have these fatty and fibrous bonds which connect the heart to the windpipe. You know, if I've just written these sentences in English, I've already interpreted the text in many ways. But when you come to model and in 3D, then where is exactly near the ear? I need to, like a GPS pinpoint, decide exactly where now to tell Yotam to split the vessel. I need to say from which point precisely is the vessel coming out of the spleen, or how do these fatty and fibrous bonds look like, or how should I represent them, how I should distinguish between them in a computer graphics way in the modeling we are doing. So again, just as some examples, and there are many more, of why we keep returning to the text, why this modeling process requires input throughout the process and is really part of us interpreting the text. So, of course, there are many models. As I said, there are numerous texts. We have lots of physicians and philosophers describing internal anatomy and describing the same parts but differently. So we have lots of anatomies to interpret and lots of models to create. But what was clear really from the beginning, and very much a motivation for this project in the first place, was the understanding that just creating models is not enough. And what we need is a platform, interface, where one can view these models with everything that scholars need, but also not view them just independently, but really have one place for them all. And not in separate kind of, opening different files all the time on your computer. And this is why we created and developed and still are developing the interactive atlas. And what I'm going to show you is a demo from our beta version, so our first version. So I'm going to show you an example of a 3D model of the anatomy according to a treatise called Sacred Disease. This is a treatise from the 5th century BC, so 2,500 years ago, discussing what we know today as epilepsy, was called then the sacred disease by many. And the author describes mainly the vascular system and the brain and some other parts, which are the most important ones for his theory of how the disease occurs. So what you're going to see is really a video capture from our atlas, which is open access. Anyone can access it, enter it, and do the searches on what is interesting for you. So what you see here is the name of what the model is. You can turn the model around, look at it from different directions, as one would look at the body. You can move it about and zoom in to the parts you want to investigate. You can see the name in transliteration and translation. You can fade a part to see the deeper layers, or hide the part completely in order to really delve deeper. And if you click on the part, you'll get an information box about that term, for instance, fleps here in Greek. And you can go to what we call the model page. This is of a different model of Aristotle respiratory system, where we explain all our interpretive decisions, the sources for the different parts of the model, give you a commentary, and an explanation of the research behind the model. You can go to what we call the lemma page, which explains the particular term in Greek or in Latin or Arabic, the history of this term in history of medicine, but also gives you the references from our database, both as a bibliography and as a concordance. And you can search for any term in Greek or English. Transliteration will suggest what you're searching for. And in the results page, you'll see the relevant terms, whether the exact particular terms or maybe where we mention this term in our lemma pages, in our discussion of the lexical entry. You can filter to see just results from a certain period, or you can sort the results, for instance, according to author, according to the period, according to what you need for your research. You can go back, of course, to the home page and start searching again. Sorry. So what you've seen here is really these different tools of the references, or the name in transliteration with translation, or an explanation of the term in the model. These are kind of these are all tools that we developed based on discussing with different researchers their needs. What would they need in order to understand the model better? When they're looking at the model, when they're reading the text and then trying to look at the model and see the connections, what information do they need? What information will they need when they're searching a term? Maybe they're not researching a particular treatise like the sacred disease, but they want to learn about the term fleps. How would they want to approach the whole search? And of course, also what you see here at the bottom left, the whole issue of the viewing tools of what would one want to do when they're playing about with the model and trying to understand the different parts. How much does one want to be able to remove it? How much modularity? All this again is part of product experts' work in our project. So, but really, we can give it various titles, but it's basically understanding that what we are doing here is not just our own research, but we want it to be useful for other scholars, and understanding how we make this useful for other scholars. So this is maybe on a large scale, but this is going back for your particular model, whatever it is. If it's the one single model, still, what do users need? What do other scholars need? Or maybe from which fields? Maybe different scholars need different things. Just to say that we're still, of course, developing the other tools and features that we want to bring in. For instance, that you would know immediately, or you can choose to know already visually, the indication of how certain we are in our interpretation, if you want to compare between models. Other scholars working on different ancient anatomies or pre-modern anatomies who want to integrate their material and create 3D models and integrate it into our atlas, and also integrate the photogrammetry, so the 3D models that we created from the dissections. So there's still a lot to think of and a lot to do, but this is now enough for the case study. So thank you very much. Thank you, of course, also to my team who have made this all possible.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Julia. I'm particularly pleased that we've had this case study, because it's quite different from what we often talk about when we're talking about 3D modeling, especially in this syllabus. We often talk about modeling of buildings or of something like an ancient vase. So it's really interesting to see that it's really accentuated the importance of footnoting your models. You'd be surprised how many people have built a reconstruction of an ancient building or amphitheater or something like this, and then they don't tell you anything about where they got it from. They just tell you this is what the ancient amphitheater looked like, and it's just really important to say according to who, according to which ancient source, according to which modern source, according to which scholar who's done it, according to which modeler or artist has been involved in it. All of those things that are really important, and also the different kind of modeling, that you're not building an ancient anatomy from an incomplete corpse that you've dug up, right? I mean, it's different from rebuilding a building. It's really trying to create not to try and get closer to the reality of an anatomy, but to an understanding of an anatomy, which I think is another really important thing for modeling. So this is possibly akin to people who are recreating mythological landscapes or objects or other things, which visualizing how they were understood to look is maybe more important than trying to archaeologically get back to some sort of empirical truth. So these are really important things coming out of this. I just sorry, I know I'm supposed to be talking about something else, but I couldn't help but get excited by this by this case study, which I think is really cool. So I was going to spend a few minutes here just giving a demo of the exercise that we propose in the session page, which again is linked below this video. And for this, I will be using the SketchUp free, or is it called SketchUp Web, version of the tool, which is not quite the version that the exercise was written for. So in a few cases, there will be slight differences in appearance, in functionality, and so forth. So I'm just here. If you download the link to the tutorial that was produced by our colleague Valeria a few years ago using Sketchup Make 2017, this is what I'll be working through. But just occasionally, I'll be having to do things slightly differently from how they're done in here. And I'm only going to go through the first handful of steps. And in fact, at some point, I will ask Orly, can you just stop me and say, that's enough. We should move on to discussion now. So I will probably go to full screen for this, and then so you'll have to unmute and audibly stop me because I won't be able to see you anymore. So this I think you're looking at now is the SketchUp site. I've just gone to the SketchUp free part of the site, and I'm just going to click on Start Modeling. And I think when this loads the interface, I think I'm already logged in to this. Yeah, I'm already logged in. If you're not, you'll need to either create an account or associate this to an open ID of some kind, or just use your Google account to log in or something. And I'm just going to say create a new model. Okay, so here's a model. There's nothing here. It's just got the three axes there, and it's got a little figure there of something that's roughly human-sized. I believe that model's based on a real person, but I don't know who it is. I'm actually going to leave the person there. Normally we'd just say, click on the person and delete them, but actually I'm going to leave them there because it will give us a sense of the scale of the building that we're creating. If we were creating something other than a building, I'd say let's just get rid of him, but let's just leave him there for the moment. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a rectangle. And so using this rectangle tool over here, and unlike on the version of SketchUp Make that we've been using, the tools are all clustered here on this left sidebar. And so the rectangle tool is this one here. And you basically draw a rectangle by clicking on the start point, which at this, for our purposes, is going to be the origin point of the universe, which is where those three axes meet, and simply drag outwards. And it doesn't matter where you drag to. You could try and drag to exactly 13.2 by 7.5 meters. But it doesn't matter where you drag to, simply drag to somewhere and release the cursor. And before you touch anything else or click on anything else, simply type the numbers, 13.2, 7.5. If you're in a part of the world where decimal points are represented using a comma rather than a full stop, then you may need to use a semicolon to separate those two numbers rather than a comma. But you'll probably figure it out. You may also need to change an option somewhere to change it from feet and inches to meters, because who the hell would use feet and inches? That's a really bizarre default. But anyway, so I've not clicked on anything else. I've just drawn the square, typed in those numbers. I press enter, and it gives me a 13.2 meter by 7.5 meter rectangle right there on the base of my model. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to use the offset tool, which I believe is hidden behind here. Yes, it's this tool here. And for this, I'm simply going to click somewhere on one of the lines and drag inwards. Yep. Okay, that didn't happen first time. Okay, the functionality is very slightly different from the version I'm familiar with, so bear with me. Okay, for some reason it's drawing outwards. And so again, if I type 0.44, yeah, it draws the offset 44 centimeters in from the outer rectangle. So what I've done is I've created the outer rectangle, 13 by 7.5 meters, and then 44 centimeters in, I've drawn another rectangle, which it's automatically offset for me. And I'm then going to use the push-pull tool, which is behind the same button, it's this one, to highlight that section of 44 centimeters, which is the wall, and I'm just going to raise that wall up. But before I do that, I just want to make a brief point. I'm going to go back to the select tool here, which is that there are two different things, two different kinds of entities that I've created here. Okay, I've created lines here, these that I'm highlighting by clicking on them so they turn blue. And then I've also created planes, okay? And a plane has to be fully defined by lines. If I delete one of those lines, then the plane disappears, because you cannot have a plane with an open edge, okay? Luckily, Control-Z will get rid of what I've just done. You can delete the plane and keep all of the lines, but you can't delete the lines and keep the plane. Okay, that's just to sort of to point out the way this works. So those are all entities there, and the same applies when you create the third dimension. When you create a volume, that needs to be fully constrained by planes. Otherwise, it isn't a complete volume either. So going back to the push-pull tool, I'm going to go to the outer edge there, which is the walls around my building. I'm going to extrude upwards by pulling, and then it doesn't matter how far I pull up because I want it to be 6 meters. I'm just going to raise it, release the cursor, not touch anything else, type 6, which you see appears down there in the bottom right, press enter, and it has given me 6 meter high walls of that building. I can rotate the view a little bit so you can see how that looks. There's basically a box which is 7.5 by 13.2 by 6 meters high, and it doesn't have a top because I haven't given it a roof. Okay, so that's the first step. The next step is to draw some guidelines which will enable us to write these walls on these doors rather into the front wall. This probably will be the last step I'll do, which is create these walls. So to create the guidelines, you want to have a relatively square view of the front, which is what I've got here. I'm not too concerned about the volume anymore. I'm just looking at the front of the object, fairly zoomed in, and I'm going to go to the guideline tool, which is this one, the measure tool, and starting at the left-hand wall, I'm going to drag inwards, and again, it doesn't matter how far I drag because I'm going to release and I'm going to type 0.73, so 73 centimeters in is where I want my first guideline. Then draw it in again, and 2 meters 35 is where I want my second guideline. Drag it in, type 3.08 where I want my third guideline. 4.7 is where I want my fourth guideline. No, something went wrong there. Okay, so 4.07, and the last one I want 5.43 for that guideline. Okay, so that's, have I got the right number of guidelines there? Yes. And then I want to do the same from the other end. So we're using exactly the same measurements. We're using 0.73. This part's not very interesting to watch, I know. 2.35. 3.08. 4.7 and 5.43. Okay, so those are the guidelines we need. We now want some vertical, some horizontal guidelines. So starting at the bottom, we want guidelines 3 meters and 3.6 meters in. So I'm going to draw a guideline there. I'm just going to type 3 and do the same and type 3.6. It puts it up there. So those are the guidelines we want. Those are not part of the model. They're just to help us visualize what we're doing for the next stage. And also anything we attempt to draw will be sort of drawn to those lines. So we'll snap to those lines and the junctions between them for purposes of drawing. And you'll see that happening in a moment. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw rectangles in these lower parts of the doors, and I'm just going to build 3 of the doors, and then you'll see why in a moment, because we can copy them for the right hand ones. So you can see if I hover over the bottom left hand corner of that rectangle there, it snaps to that intersection of the guideline with the edge of the wall, and again if I drag it up to the right hand side, it snaps to that intersection of 2 guidelines. And when I release it, it's drawn a rectangle in that area. And I can do the same with a rectangle here, and the same with a rectangle. I started in the wrong place. Control Z. Nope, did it again. More haste, less speed. There. And it looks like the second one disappeared, so I'll take that back up. Okay. Okay, so I've drawn 3 of those so far. The next thing we want to do is to draw an arc above each of those doors, and I think the arc tool is it's here, and I want to use this, which is the 2-point arc. And the way you draw an arc here is you first define the one end of the base, then you define the other end of the base, and then you define the height of the arc. So I go to the one end of the base, which is one end point here, which is the top of the door, and I click on it once. I then go across and click on the other end point. I then go back to the midpoint and draw upwards, and all of this without clicking, and then the third click is at the top of the arc. So I've only clicked 3 times. I clicked there, went across, clicked again, back to the midpoint, followed it up, and then clicked the 3rd time to get the 3rd part of that arc. Okay, I'll do that again here. Click once, click a 2nd time, draw the arc upwards, click the 3rd time there. Okay, I'll do that again. Click at the left hand of the arc, click at the right hand of the arc, find the midpoint, pull it upwards, click the 3rd time at the top of the arc. Okay, so I've got 3 of those doors in there. I now no longer need the horizontal line in between the rectangle and the arc. So I'm going to go to the eraser tool up here, and I'm just going to click on that horizontal line. And because we still have a fully constrained shape between that, what is now an arch shape, we've got something that still works. I then want to copy the 1st and 2nd one of those doors into the 3rd, the 4th and 5th positions over there. So if I go to the select tool and I click on the line, see there I'm copying I've got the line highlighted, not the plane inside it. I then use shift click to select the other, let me do that, just the lines there. So I've got the 4 lines that are all highlighted there in blue, and I'm then dragging that line. Hang on, I need to go to the move tool. At the move tool, I select that line and I drag the entire thing over to here. Is that the same size as for there? Yes, no, it's not. So I take it all the way over to the 5th place, and then I think it's Alt. No, I did the wrong thing. Again, this is different on a Mac, which I normally use. So it's Shift and drag, I think, then. Yeah, it makes a duplicate of it. Okay, so if you drag it while holding down the Shift key on your on a Windows machine, I think it's the Option key or the Alt key on a Mac. You make a duplicate of that shape over there, and I'm going to do the same for the 2nd.
Gabriel, maybe do you want to just demonstrate the final stage of creating the door on one of them, and then?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've got the. I'll just drag the last one across as I just demonstrated. I don't need to narrate it this time. I'll put that into here while holding down Shift, so it copies it, but it didn't. No. Okay. Fine. I'll work out what I did wrong there some other time. So then making the hole as you suggest, I'm going to use the push-pull tool again, but this time instead of making the shape bigger, I'm going to make it smaller. So I'm going to go to that surface on the inside of that door, and I'm going to push it through, and I can either just push it until it disappears, or which as I have done, and you see the distance down the bottom says 0.44, which we know is the thickness of that wall. Okay, or I could have just typed in 0.44 and got that that hole through. And then because I've just pushed that that hole through the wall at 44 centimeters deep, rather than having to do it again each time, I can actually now just double click with this tool on a space and it will do the same thing that I just did. So it'll double click, it'll make another 44 centimeter deep hole through that wall. And I won't do the fourth one because I did something wrong when creating the wall, but you see the general principle. So that was the first 16 or so points of the 40 something points on the tutorial. And I think, yes, we should go back to discussion here. The rest of it, yes, as I say, you can follow that along yourselves.
So cool.
Good. Cool. So again, anyone who's watching this live, please do ask questions. We can see anything that you put in live chat in here, and we'll address them. In the meantime, does anyone have anything they want to add or questions you want to ask of each other?
Maybe I can just add to give two other perspectives while people are perhaps asking questions. One thing to say about the modeling way that, new modeling methods which are coming in. Obviously your Tom can talk more expertly about them, but so one thing we are experimenting now is VR modeling. So modeling with VR glasses and tools, which has various issues with it and various questions, but can also expedite very much the process, requires different learning, different software, but is obviously very exciting and can save a lot of time and can allow one to create much more complex structures much more quickly. Correct me if I'm wrong, Yotam. And another issue is of really using, for instance, for something like anatomy, but using, as you were saying before, Gabriel, we have the issue of how realistic do we want to be? And do we, doing it from scratch is very important. So in order not to reach too much, trying to stick to the reality that we are seeing, which is of course of a particular specimen at the moment. And this is touching on various issues which related to atlases and so forth. But using 3D medical imagery, such as from CAT scans and MRI scans, which are available, and from them you have a basic model, 3D model, which is of a real particular body, and using and taking that as a basis, and then sculpturing it and manipulating it to adapt it to your needs. But again, thinking of something like taking something from the photogrammetry and then manipulating it and adapting it. So these are again all ways of thinking of how one creates a 3D model and what is the basis and what can help us in the process. Another issue about presenting is, of course, the VR, which we are also now experimenting with, and some things are very simple, but also bringing it into the platform to our atlas. But of course, it's very exciting to be able to look at the model as in VR or to integrate it into so augmented reality applications. And a further aspect is, of course, the 3D printing, which we've just begun to look at and think of and experiment with. But of course, what happens if we know that we want to print? How do we need to prepare the model? How does one print complex matters? And here too, one can always think of going to professionals. So this is something that might be easier once one has created the model to find especially in universities, usually have 3D centers which have also cheaper prices for students or staff. So this is also something to bear in mind. Not everything we need to deal with on our own.
I have a question
in terms of the impact or the engagement with all the resources that you have shown and all the models, and how, if you have had any feedback from scientists apart from the ones that were involved, because you were mentioning that it's a very interdisciplinary project. So apart from those involved, have you had any feedback or comments or of people acknowledging how this can be really interesting and valuable in terms of understanding how modern medicine has developed and how we have come up with the knowledge we have now? Have you had or done any surveys or research or of how people can use it in CAS?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. We have had some feedback. I'll explain and I'll say which in a moment, but just to say that part of what we are now planning is, now that we are working now on adding a lot of content, so there's more to do and we can get better feedback, and then going out to a sort of second user research. So speaking to people, giving them various questions, and again, different kinds of scholars, because we had started very much from our core ancient medicine scholars. What we have had is from instructors of anatomy, of modern anatomy, especially human anatomy, and students and instructors talking very much about, for instance, etymology and terminology, because a lot of the terms today are based or even very similar to the terms that we have, they're the ancient terms, sometimes with a change of meaning, sometimes not, sometimes the modern language, the modern technical terms, which are Latin, Greek, still incorporate very kind of good tricks of understanding. If you understand a bit of the terms, you can understand many more. So they are eager to incorporate parts of our, of our different material, the visual and the more lexical material, into their teaching when they talk about, so not just for their parts where they talk about the history of medicine, which is also an important issue, but really when they teach, okay, now we're talking about mass culture and this is the kind of terminology we are using, we can see how this is what it meant in Greek or in antiquity. This is how it came about to mean what you are learning today. And it's shown to be very useful for students. We're still very much at the beginning of this. And we've also asked them to tell us what they need. So we could, kind of work also on particular pages for that. But also for the part, both this issue and the issue for just the general introductions they give for history of medicine, what's important is that this atlas really talks in the language, that in the visual language and tools that students and instructors of medicine and anatomy specifically are very familiar with. So if we give them an ancient text, it's not something that they necessarily want to engage with, can engage with, have the time to engage with. This is very much what they know how to work with. So these are very much part of our users that we're thinking of. Of course, they need different things from what the historians of medicine or classicists need, but sometimes these things also overlap, and we're definitely talking to them as well. So fortunately, we've had quite good feedback, and they're very excited. And part of the things they would want us to add are things that we're thinking of anyway, like the physiological and processes of how things are working inside these structures. So this is another issue to think of course, in 3D, of kind of animating our models or making something go through them. So another world.
That's great. It would be really interesting to see how the feedback develops and how, what results you get, because I think in digital humanities projects in general, it's very interesting to see how experts in the domain react and how they use it, and involve the new resource in their practices is really, really, really important, and it will be a really good output as well to see how the resource is used.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, relatedly to, I think probably you've already answered this with your last comment, Orly, but when we were thinking earlier about how 3D modeling can sometimes be used, for example, to simulate structural strength of buildings and similar, whether there was any potential for doing that with some of these models of the body. So presumably, I mean, there's medical software that can sort of simulate, what impact does it have on the vascular system if the heart increases or decreases in size. So, could you run your model in some way to say, well, if the heart was the size that Hippocrates thought it was, how fast would it have to beat in order to get blood around the body? I mean, those sorts of calculations, and maybe that's a naive example, but.
That's wow, that's an excellent question. Excellent ideas. That's I'm glad this has been recorded, so I don't need to write it down because there's a lot to think of here. Yotam might have some ideas, but I can also say that actually our main partner in the veterinary school, he's actually the head of the lab of bone and biomechanics in the veterinary medicine, and they deal a lot with software to testing the strength of bones and what happens upon impact using the 3D modeling. So there's a lot of software for that, but that's a very particular example. And of course, what you're suggesting is already really simulating various aspects which are connected to the physiology and the anatomy. That's great ideas, Gabriel. Thank you. A lot to think of. Yeah, there's a lot more to come from us. So now we have another world to get to think of. Okay, sorry, my mind's running ahead now. Thank you for that.
There's the sort of thing that there is software that does. I mean, in as you say, in medicine and.
Yotam, do you maybe have? Yotam is also an expert in not only medical, legal illustrations, but also in forensics and 3D forensics medicine. Is there any software for maybe kind of simulating, how much the heart, how big the heart would have to be to send a particular volume of air or blood?
Well, I'm not sure. I guess if there are softwares like this, I guess they are very specific to the human body. They are very specific to specific sensors connected to a body. But however, I do think that I have two ideas in my mind. One is the ability to do physical simulations in some 3D softwares like Cinema 4D, Blender, and so forth. You have the ability to simulate physical events like a flow of fluid, a flow of gas, or to break something and to determine like mathematical parameters of the strength of a certain vessel. So we can test our models, like getting stuff through them and change the strength of the vessel and see if they rupture in some situation. And another thing I think we can do in the future is to 3D print a system of vessels and really pour fluids through them with a pump or something like that, and see if it ruptures or not. The options are endless. Yeah, we do it in my institute to try and do a reconstruction of a criminal event, like a shooting or a car accident or a stabbing, with physical simulations. But maybe we can apply it here also. We'll see.
Thanks very much for the question. We'll we have a lot to talk about now.
Oh, by the way, software-wise, I'm sorry to interrupt. It is worth reminding that also today one of the best softwares we have to model organic models is ZBrush. Very, very cool software, a very cool software used that is used mostly to create monsters and zombies and stuff like that. But anyway, it has an amazing capability of modeling organic structures. So I recommend also trying that. I think they have a free version also.
Fantastic, thanks. Yeah, I'll definitely add that to that slide for next year. I see that's part of the Maxon stable, similar to Cinema 4D. Yeah, no, this reminds me that when we were talking about this session a few days ago, Orly, we talked about the parallels in using 3D modeling for research to the more traditional practice of experimental archaeology, where people would go out into the wilds and build a Iron Age roundhouse in using the materials that would have been used originally to get things like how easy it is to heat and what happens to the smoke and all that sort of thing, and it strikes me that the parallels between that and the parallels with some of these sort of forensic reconstructions that you're talking about are very, very close, because they're doing the same thing, whether you're doing it with with software with sort of well understood parameters, or whether you're doing it with an actual object to try and better understand those parameters. I presume you don't very often now, that not necessarily you, but forensic scientists now don't very often have to take a pig carcass out into the countryside to see how long it takes to decompose, because those sorts of things are reasonably well understood, and software can do a lot of that comparison for you. So I think that's that sort of thing. Similarly to why we use 3D reconstructions a lot more than we use, as well as the expense, more than we would build new reconstructions, out of stone and wood, in archaeology. So the parallels there, actually, I could think those through a little bit more. But
I also it is very interesting, and I also want to add that for people who hear us now and think, oh, 3D modeling is so hard, you only think like that in the beginning. Like after 2 days, you're so into it that you can't stop. So I think the connection between like your profession to 3D modeling and Atlomy can create a very, very interesting discussion. And like when a classical researcher can model a basic thing, he can visually suggest changes to Atlomy. So it can open a gate to a very, very interesting domain of research and discussion, I think.
And again, questions of documentation and the sorts of metadata and paradata that Orly was talking about. Those, there'll be slightly different questions, but the issues, I think, across different kinds of modeling, I think are going to be quite similar. There's an example that I'm trying to see whether we've included it in the readings, and I don't see it there, but we should add it if we don't, which is the aulos that Tosca talked about last year, which it's an ancient object being reconstructed using 3D modeling, but they're particularly interested again in the flow of air through this flute, in terms of the sorts of sounds it would make, the sorts of methods that you would have to use to play it, the sorts of materials that would have been most appropriate for using for various parts of it, for the reed and things like this, that has a lot in common with some of the very, very intricate concerns of your anatomical models that maybe slightly differently from reconstructing a building. Which
I must say, and this is something I've mentioned to you before, that so for me, speaking to people like you and the courses and the summer course, and talking to people from cultural heritage and archaeology has been very much it's been eye-opening, because a lot of the issues and methodology and what one needs to offer and how to offer it are very similar in a way. And in many ways, these are peers who have a lot of better understanding of the issues and challenges that I'm dealing with, or my team is dealing with, than people from just history of science. I mean, not that one is instead of the other, but it's a different world, and I do urge people to also, you know, we last year we had Tosco talking about musical instruments. We spoke today about anatomy. We're speaking about archaeology, but I mean, there are just so many things that when you're doing research in classics or sort of beyond, that one can think of how to present our ideas in this visual way, in this interactive way, even if you cannot do it yourself and you need the help. So it's worth kind of, sorry, it's worth opening the mind to these issues, even if it's not, you know, anatomy or culture, you know, archaeology is not what you're doing and thinking of. So many things can be presented in this way, and it's very important for outreach, for grants, for anything, you know. So even if you're thinking in a practical means, this is a good way to be going.
I had one more question about the issue of documentation that Gabi just mentioned, and metadata and paradata, and how important it is, not just in the process, but also to make it available afterwards. And I was wondering, because I know you are collecting all this data, of course, in the process of making the models and the decisions that you made and all that, but have you had discussions with the team on how this information is going to be made available, in what format? Because there are a lot of discussions happening now on, like, should we use linked open data? Should we just make it available as a spreadsheet together with the model? Like how best we can embed it, and how best we can facilitate access of people interested in the model itself, so that they see the importance of seeing the decisions and trace back the process.
So this is one of the main aims of the atlas and the software. So the idea is, in the software you have everything you need. So you have the 3D viewer where you can view, but all the learning tools behind. And we are working, this is exactly what we want to be asking users in our next user research, of what do they want on the 3D model page. Do they want more information? Do you want to click on a part and also see the reference and the citation, or just that it just, you know, it just, there's too much information and you want it separately? So basically everything at the backbone of the atlas is our database, is our terms, are the individual lemmas and the different references. And the idea is that through, like, this list of references, which are, again, are open to anyone and open access, you can see, instead of just having our Excel sheets, which we use a program which is kind of for project managing, which is a shared software, but it doesn't matter, it's still a table. Instead of just giving you our table, which, you know, we could give that to you, but here we've already digested the material for you, because what you want is the reference, right? You might also want the quote. So that's an issue of what we have, all this data. So it's about where do people want us, our users want, and again, not making all these decisions on our own according to what we might think, but speaking to these people and speaking to different kinds of people of where they would want, what information they want more, what data, and where would they like it, when, on which, you know, what. And this is really the field of our product experts, of translating what people think they need to how it should be in the software. So you might tell me, I really want, you know, to click here and see it, but through our product expert, you will understand it's not that what you really need is this kind of information at this stage. It's not really by clicking on it that you need to have it. But another thing is, of course, that we will be publishing our data sets on Zenodo or OpenAir, so these kind of open access repositories. Again, these might be useful for some people, but I think for most people, the whole part of the software is to make our data accessible, regardless of the 3D models even, our data accessible in a digested manner, and that you can play around with. But absolutely, this is very much the thought of how to make this open, accessible, transparent.
Yeah, because also that's connected with the session we had last week in terms of intellectual property rights and accessibility, you know, and recognizing credit, not just in creating the model, but in all the decisions that have gone towards that model, and being able to see who is there, and you know.
Yes, that's also something that we've been discussing about. The credits are a bit different for the model, from the lemma page, from the model page explaining the research behind, the atlas as an atlas, and of course coming from the humanities, especially not from the field of archaeology and the humanities. These are issues that we're not always so used to talking about, but here again, it's good sometimes not to be so used, because when I talk to colleagues from other fields, their answers are very particular and not always what suits our team, the way we work. I mean, your time is part of the creation of the model, and the interpretation of the text, even if not writing the lemma page of what the Greek term means, right? So these are different issues, and again, it's an issue of where do you put these credits, of course.
Yeah, and how to reuse the model as well, as if it was a publication in itself, right? Like, should we assign a DOI, or how do we reference properly all the work that's behind the
model? At the moment, we have to put it on Zenodo. So we need to take the model. The good thing about it is that you can then have an archive of maybe the different stages, because our models, we've already improved some models. So, but yes, for the DOI, for this kind of crediting and recognition of, you know, as scholars and our careers of publications, we need the repositories which offer some useful tools, but you know, then we lose everything that the tailor-made software gives us. So, but I think we might have a different conversation in a few years' time. I hope. It's all very.
But maybe they can, you know, talk to each other somehow, the repository and the software itself, or see how we can find those connections, or make them more, emphasize them more.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I'll think about that. Thank you.
We have similar issues in terms of how to publish the models. We were using Picture, but at first it didn't render the model. Now they have developed further, and now we can render the model on Picture, and you can still cite the model with the DOI, which is quite cool, because like that you can reference it. But nothing compared to the software that you have just.
That's great. Thank you. No, that's a very good point to think of.
In relation to the 3D models specifically, Gabriel, I think maybe I imagined. I think you said that in the next session you're going to talk about like different ways, the best ways of uploading 3D models online.
In 2 weeks, we will give some examples of that. Yes.
It's very interesting. I have to say that from the 3D modeler's perspective, in many times the problem for me was not how to model, but how to model correctly for the model to be good for uploading online. So this was the challenge many times, and not the modeling itself.
And this also affects the software that we use for different stages. Just to you know, just as a weird example, but which took us so long to solve, is that one of the main software we are using, Maya, which is a very sort of heavy-duty modeling software, it couldn't recognize all the characters we needed, which we had taken into account in the code we wrote, which our code takes the model and puts it in the software, showing the different names. So when you hover, so we couldn't put a hyphen or something like that. And, you know, it took us ages, and we really thought to leave that software just because of this particular issue. But in the end, we walked around it and we changed our code, so our software code to deal with this. But so just as a sort of one end of this kind of examples of, as your Tam was saying, so I guess you will be talking about Sketchfab. So what do we need in order to make sure that the model works there properly. And I think often it's much easier than, I don't want to scare anyone with this. It's often much easier than one would expect. But just again, sometimes you have you think everything's correct and something, a small pin in the way is a small hype makes the difference.
It was really funny actually that we needed to leave Maya, which is like a thousands of dollars worth software, to Blender, because Blender did manage to export this hyphen and Maya didn't. And Maya is like a worldwide industry standard software and Blender is open source. So it was like a funny situation.
Cool. Yeah, no, this is all really important, and as you say, we'll talk a little bit more about dissemination and so forth of 3D models in a couple of weeks. For today, as Monica would normally say at this stage, our time is over. But thank you all very much again for this session. This was really interesting. Some really important points coming up. A lot of the discussion about a documentation imperator and the importance of that will come up again in the readings that we have on the session page, and will be discussed again in future, no doubt. As I say, the next 3D session is in 2 weeks, but in 1 week's time we have a session where Paula and also her colleague Victoria Donlan from the British Museum Catalogue are going to talk about museum collection data and metadata and related things, which is of course all still on this same theme from a different perspective. So please do join us here for that at SunoikisisDC if you can, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.